And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me is Juan Zarate. He's our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you as always.
Bob, great seeing you.
The state of play with ISIS. We now see stepped up U.S. airstrikes along the Turkish border. We see a game where ISIS seems to fall back and then they kind of regroup and then they move. Is this air campaign working?
Well, it's working in part, but if the question is it working to ultimately degrade ISIS? Is it stopping their advances and their onslaught in certain cities, not just in Syria, but in Iraq? The answer is no. It's not working. It was never going to be the talisman. It was never going to be the dispositive factor in stopping ISIS. But what's being exposed is a couple things, Bob. One, the group's adapting. They understand what's coming at them, and so they're trying to adapt by embedding and also continuing their offenses. And two, they are continuing a multi-front offensive. And so this isn't just an attack on Kobani. ISIS, while they were doing that, was also expanding in other parts of Syria and also trying to take over parts of Iraq that they didn't have control over. So this is a group that remains very aggressive. The airstrikes certainly haven't deterred them. And it hasn't slowed their advances in certain parts of Syria and Iraq.
There are propaganda campaigns in full swing. Now we've seen terribly 4 beheadings, threatening to kill another American. What needs to happen? I mean, how do we get a handle on this? It almost seems like it calls for some kind of big ground force.
Yeah, what you see, and especially in the context of Kobani, which is the Syrian city that sits right across the border from Turkey, you see the Turkish tanks sitting there along the border. And what one wonders is, when's the cavalry coming? You know, when are we going to see the ground forces, especially in the Syrian context, that can push back on ISIS, that won't let the black flags of that movement fly over these cities? And I think the U.S. really wants and has expected Turkey to enter the fray. And Turkey to date, as we've talked about before, has been unwilling. Unwilling in part because it means, in some ways, being in league with Kurdish forces that they have largely opposed in the past, that are tied to the PKK, the movement that they've been fighting for a number of years. It also means perhaps ceding the centrality of their foreign policy goal, which is to see the fall of Assad, not necessarily to fight ISIS. And so we're really in a moment of crisis in terms of what does it mean to actually degrade and push back this group if you don't have ground forces, either Turkish, Kurdish, or even the forces that the U.S. is trying to train to push back on the ground in Syria.
The president has been absolute. No boots on the ground, no U.S. ground forces there. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, said maybe someday I might have to ask for ground forces. Do you see a scenario at all where that might be the case, where the president has to backtrack on that and say, well, we need to do this?
I think he might, but I think they're going to parse this till the cows come home, because they're going to make a distinction, I think, ultimately between mass amounts of combat troops, the 101st Airborne, for example, versus putting special operations spotters and tacticians and specialists on the ground. Because I think at least in the short term, there is going to have to be consideration for putting some trusted actors on the ground. It may not be American, but it may be allied special forces down in a place where they can act as spotters, perhaps help lead some counteroffenses. But simply relying on air power alone, as we've seen in recent days, is not going to be enough.
Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.